when that movie came out. Was anything cut from that film?
The studio actually legally couldn't trim it. They couldn't cut anything.
There's a moment buried inside one of the most chaotic, loudest, most deliberately anarchic comedies ever produced in Hollywood history. And for 50 years, almost nobody caught it. Not the critics who reviewed it. Not the film scholars who wrote about it. Not even the diehard fans who have watched it dozens of times and can quote every single line by heart. It slipped through the cracks of a production so intentionally messy, so gloriously out of control, that hiding something in plain sight was almost too easy. We are talking about Blazing Saddles, the 1974 Mel Brooks comedy that rewrote the rules of what movies were allowed to say, allowed to show, and allowed to get away with. And somewhere inside that magnificent mess, something went wrong. Or maybe it went right, depending on how you look at it. What we are about to discuss is either the greatest unintentional mistake in comedy film history, or the most perfectly accidental genius move a director never planned. So settle in, because once you know what to look for, you will never be able to watch this film the same way again. To understand why this blooper matters, you first have to understand what kind of film Blazing Saddles actually was, and why its very existence was something close to a miracle. By the early 1970s, Hollywood was going through a complete identity crisis. The old studio system had collapsed. The Hays Code, which had governed what could and could not appear on screen for decades, was finally gone. A new generation of filmmakers was rushing into the space that opened up, and they were not interested in playing it safe. At the same time, America itself was cracking apart at the seams. Vietnam had turned into a national wound that would not close. Watergate had exposed the government as something rotten at its very core. The civil rights movement had won its legal battles, but the cultural war was nowhere near finished. Racism was not some distant, historical problem. It was alive, embedded, and completely normalized inside mainstream entertainment, including the movies that millions of Americans watched every single weekend. The Hollywood Western, in particular, had spent decades telling a very specific kind of story. White men were the heroes. Everyone else was either a villain, a sidekick, or background scenery. The cowboy myth was sacred, polished, and completely disconnected from any honest version of American history. Indigenous people were portrayed as nameless threats. Black Americans barely existed on screen at all, and the audiences mostly accepted this because it was all they had ever been shown. Mel Brooks saw all of this and decided the right response was not a serious drama or a thoughtful documentary. The right response was to blow the entire genre sky high with the most outrageous, irreverent, and deliberately offensive comedy he could possibly construct. What emerged from that decision was Blazing Saddles, a film that used laughter as a wrecking ball and somehow got away with swinging it directly at the most sensitive targets imaginable. The story on the surface is simple enough. A corrupt politician, trying to drive settlers out of a small town called Rock Ridge so he can run a railroad through it, hatches a plan to appoint a black sheriff, assuming the townspeople will revolt and abandon their homes in protest. What he did not count on was that the new sheriff, a man named Bart, would be smarter, cooler, and more capable than every single person trying to destroy him. The joke was on the racists. It was always on the racists. But getting that joke made and into theaters required fighting battles that had nothing to do with comedy at all. The making of Blazing Saddles was, by almost every account, a production disaster that somehow became a masterpiece. From the very beginning, nothing went according to plan, and the fact that the film exists in the form it does is partly a product of accident, stubbornness, and a director who refused to let anyone else define what his movie was going to be. The script itself was a collaboration between Mel Brooks and Richard Pryor, arguably the most fearless and sharp black comedian working in America at that time. Pryor understood intimately the kind of racism the film was targeting. He did not need it explained to him. He had lived it. His contributions to the script gave the material an edge and an authenticity that pure satire from the outside could never have achieved. The original plan was for Pryor to also play Sheriff Bart, the lead role. It made complete sense. He helped write the character. He understood the character from the inside out. But Warner Brothers, the studio financing the film, refused to insure him because of his documented personal struggles. Without insurance, you cannot put an actor on a major film set. The role went to Cleavon Little instead, a a Broadway-trained actor who brought something entirely different to the part. Where Pryor might have played Bart with raw, burning energy, Little played him with cool precision and a dry wit that somehow made the racial satire even sharper. The casting disaster turned into a gift, though it did not feel that way at the time. Then came the next crisis. The role of the Waco Kid, a once legendary gunslinger now hiding from his own reputation, was first given to Gig Young, a respected and Oscar-winning actor. He seemed like the right choice on paper, but on his very first day of filming, he collapsed on set. He was experiencing severe alcohol withdrawal symptoms, and production shut down completely. Brooks needed a replacement immediately. He called Gene Wilder, with whom he had worked previously, described the character in a single panic phone call, and Wilder said yes on the spot. He flew out the following day and began filming almost immediately. His performance became one of the most beloved elements of the entire movie. None of it was planned. All of it was improvised by circumstance. Then there was the studio itself, watching the dailies and growing increasingly horrified with every passing day. When Warner Brothers executives sat down for a private screening of the completed film, the room went completely silent. There was no laughter. There was no applause. There were only worried men in expensive suits wondering how they had allowed something this dangerous to be made with their money. One executive reportedly called it career-ending. Another said it was too vulgar for any mainstream American audience. They wanted it buried. A quiet, limited release in a few cities, low expectations, and then a quick, dignified disappearance. What stopped them was the contract. Mel Brooks had final cut authority written into his deal. The studio legally could not touch a single frame of the film without his explicit permission. They were stuck with exactly what he had made. Part of what makes the blooper we are building towards so fascinating is the context in which it exists. Blazing Saddles was not a film where mistakes stood out because the production was tight and controlled. It was a film that actively invited chaos and then kept the results. This was entirely deliberate on Brooks's part. He had a filmmaking philosophy rooted in the belief that comedy lived in the unexpected, in the moment where something went slightly sideways and the camera kept rolling anyway. The campfire flatulence sequence is the most obvious example of this philosophy in action. In 1974, no major studio film had ever included a scene like it. Cowboys sitting around a fire after a meal, audibly and repeatedly passing gas, the sounds fully recorded and mixed into the final cut. It was juvenile, it was shocking, and according to test audiences, it was absolutely hilarious. Brooks actually went back during post-production and added more sounds because the original laughter from the test audience was so loud it was drowning out the end of the gag. But the scene was not just about being gross. It was a direct attack on the mythology of the American cowboy. For generations, Westerns had presented these men as stoic, heroic, almost superhuman figures. Brooks wanted to remind everyone that they were just men who slept in the dirt and ate beans. The romanticized image that Hollywood had spent decades constructing got deflated by a sound effect, and the studio executives who wanted to cut the scene simply did not have the authority to do it. The same philosophy extended to the performances. Brooks actively encouraged his actors to improvise, to deviate from the script, to find the funny thing that was not written down anywhere. Cleveland Little's quiet sarcasm and perfectly timed pauses were largely his own creation on set. Gene Wilder's sleepy, disconnected delivery as the Waco Kid was not precisely what the script described. Madeline Kahn, playing the glamorous and scheming Lily Von Stupp, improvised several of her most iconic moments, including the breathy, deliberately off-pitch torch song that stopped the film cold in the best possible way. Brooks did not fight any of this. He encouraged it. He believed that the best version of a comedy was not the most perfectly rehearsed one, but the most alive one. And alive things are unpredictable. This also explains the famous Yiddish-speaking Native Americans. In a flashback sequence depicting a moment from Bart's childhood, his family encounters a group of warriors on horseback. The tension of the scene sets up what looks like it could be a terrifying moment, and then the tribal chief, played by Brooks himself, opens his mouth and speaks fluent Yiddish. Other warriors nod. One calls out a traditional Sabbath greeting. It is surreal, disorienting, and very funny, but it is also making a pointed argument about the way Hollywood Westerns had historically treated indigenous people reducing them to a nameless, voiceless other. By giving them Yiddish instead of silence or stereotyped war whoops, Brooks was holding up a mirror to the absurdity of those old portrayals and asking the audience to see what they looked like from the outside. The humor and the critique were completely inseparable. All of that context matters because it explains how a blooper of this particular nature could survive all the way into the final cut of a major studio film and remain unnoticed for decades. The film was already so deliberately strange, so intentionally chaotic, that something genuinely accidental could hide inside it without ever attracting attention. The moment in question occurs during the film's climactic finale, a sequence where the boundaries between the fictional world of Rock Ridge and the real world of Hollywood literally collapse. The characters break through the walls of the Warner Brothers studio and spill out onto the lot itself, crashing through the sets of other productions, fighting through a musical number that has nothing to do with anything, and eventually tumbling out through the studio gates and onto the actual streets outside. It is one of the earliest and most ambitious fourth wall breaks in American comedy, a sequence that influenced everything from Ferris Bueller's Day Off to the Deadpool franchise. The entire point is that reality and fiction have stopped being separate things. Characters know they are in a movie. The movie knows it is a movie, and the audience is invited to laugh at the fact that any of this was ever supposed to be taken seriously. It is inside this deliberately uncontrolled chaos that the blooper lives. As the cast pours out of the studio gate and onto the street, a figure appears in the background of the shot. He is wearing a plain sweater. He is not in costume. He is not moving like a man who has been directed by anyone. He is simply walking, calmly, casually, with no particular urgency, moving through the middle of a scene in a major Hollywood film as if he is on his way to buy a sandwich. He is not an extra. No one hired him. No one told him where to stand or which direction to walk. He is simply a person who happened to be walking by the studio at the exact moment the cameras were rolling, who wandered into frame, and who was captured for all time in the final cut of a film that would go on to be considered one of the greatest comedies ever made. When the crew pointed him out, assuming the shot would need to be redone, Brooks looked at the footage and made a decision that was entirely consistent with everything else he had done throughout the entire production. He told them to leave it in. The man's complete obliviousness, his casual, utterly unconcerned presence in the middle of this enormous, absurd spectacle, was funnier than anything scripted could have been. He was real. He was accidental. And he was perfect. A random pedestrian became, without ever knowing it, part of cinematic history. What makes this blooper particularly remarkable when you examine it closely is not just that it happened, but that it actually works within the film's logic in a way that nothing else could have matched. The entire ending sequence is about the collapse of the barrier between fiction and reality. And then, right on cue, a completely real, completely unscripted real person walks through the shot. He is not pretending to be unaware that he is in a movie. He genuinely is unaware. He is the only person in that entire sequence who has no idea what is happening. And that authentic confusion, that real, unperformed obliviousness, is the purest possible expression of everything the ending was trying to say. In a film full of actors pretending to break the fourth wall, a stranger accidentally broke it for real, and nobody noticed for years. The reason this blooper went undetected for so long has everything to do with the environment it lived in. If you placed this moment in a conventional film, a drama, or a straightforward comedy, with clean production values and careful editing, it would jump out immediately. A random person in a sweater walking through a climactic scene would be obviously wrong. It would stop the audience cold. Someone would have caught it in the editing room, and the shot would have been redone without question. But Blazing Saddles was not a conventional film. The entire final sequence was designed to look like it was falling apart. Characters are brawling in multiple directions simultaneously. A choreographed dance number erupts for no reason. Mel Brooks himself appears as the governor, signing documents in a mobile office while the chaos swirls around him. People crash through walls. Real studio equipment is visible in the background. The deliberate artifice of filmmaking is on full display everywhere you look. In that context, a man in a sweater walking calmly through the background does not register as a mistake. He registers as another layer of absurdity in a scene that is already built entirely out of absurdity. The brain processes him as intentional because everything else around him is intentional chaos. He hides in plain sight not because he is invisible, but because the film trained the audience to expect exactly this kind of unexpected thing. There is also something to be said for the way audiences experience comedy versus the way they experience drama. In a serious film, viewers are alert to continuity errors and background inconsistencies because those things pull them out of an emotional investment. In a comedy that has already broken its own reality multiple times, the audience is already slightly disoriented and laughing. Their guard is down in a specific way. They are not watching carefully for mistakes. They are just trying to keep up with the gags coming at them from every direction. The pedestrian slips by in that laughter-induced blind spot and does not get caught. What this moment ultimately reveals about Blazing Saddles is something that goes deeper than just an amusing behind-the-scenes story. It reveals that the film's greatest strength was always its relationship with reality itself. Brooks built a film that kept insisting on the gap between the polished myths Hollywood told and the messy, uncomfortable truths underneath them. He attacked the Western genre because Westerns were the purest expression of that gap. And then, almost as if the universe wanted to underline the point, reality itself wandered onto a set in the form of a stranger in a sweater and proved that real life was stranger and funnier than anything scripted. The film went on to earn over $100 million, a staggering figure for a comedy in 1974, after Warner Brothers had tried to bury it with a quiet, limited release in just a handful of cities. The studio that panicked in the screening room was forced to scramble and expand distribution as the film became the biggest comedy hit of the year. Critics who had been skeptical found themselves writing serious essays about it. Film scholars began studying it. Comedy filmmakers began learning from it. And all the while, in the final sequence of that film, a man in a sweater kept walking calmly through a shot that nobody was looking at closely enough. Blazing Saddles endures because it understood something about comedy that most films of its era did not. The funniest things are often the truest things, and the truest things are often the ones that were never planned at all. The fart jokes were planned. The fourth wall break was planned. The Yiddish-speaking warriors were planned. But the stranger walking through the background was not planned by anyone. He just happened. The way real life always just happens, without asking permission, without hitting its marks, and without knowing that anyone was watching. In a film about tearing down illusions, the most honest moment of all was the one nobody saw coming and almost nobody noticed when it arrived. That is the huge blooper in Blazing Saddles that nobody noticed until now. And the most remarkable thing about it is